really good to attend if this is something you're interested in delivering a lot. But I find this topology that Joyce Scaife put together about the ways you can run a group as really helpful to conceptualize different kinds of groups. She talks about 4 different types of groups. The first one is authoritative group supervision, which is essentially the supervisor supervising individuals with an audience. So the group don't participate in the conversation apart from when it's their turn to present their case, and the supervisor supervises that individual with other people watching. There are advantages and disadvantages to this. You know, the real advantages, I guess, are that you don't necessarily get the kind of difficult issues around group dynamics arising. It kind of functions a bit like a masterclass. But on the other hand, you know, I guess the risk is that, you know, those who are not participating just kind of are quite inactive and fall asleep during the time when they're not actively involved. The richness from the group isn't fully utilised, and actually it doesn't really develop group skills or the potential for the group in any way. So moving onwards then, you might instead want to have a more participative group, supervision with a group, where there's still the supervisor who supervises, but the group members are more encouraged to participate actively, which can, you know, enhance that richness and provide a bit more of a forum for the development of skills and of group interaction skills. But, you know, the more you get along in this direction, the harder it gets to share time between people in a group. We all know that feeling, I think, of people, at least when I've supervised groups, running out of time is just an absolute nightmare. The group can become quite busy, and often group dynamics might get in the way of that safe and reflective space if they're not well managed. It's initially hard to work for the supervisor to set this up and to get it running well, and it can be quite daunting for supervisors to start to run these kind of groups. Moving further along then in that direction, we can even move from that more facilitative group to a much more cooperative group, where there's still a supervisor, but actually the responsibility for supervision is much more shared amongst the group. So this can work really well when you're a more established group of practitioners, and it really encourages supervision skill development in quite a nice way. But it can mean that the supervisor ends up becoming a bit laissez-faire, and that means actually an increase in a sense of unsafety within the group. It can become riskier because actually there's more potential for group dynamics not to be managed well within it. And finally, at the other end of the spectrum, we've got the peer group supervision, where actually there isn't a named supervisor and everyone takes responsibility for the supervision, and it's negotiated amongst people where there isn't one named person who's taking a lead. This can be really good, but I think the difficulty is that it needs real good self-discipline for it to be managed. Oftentimes you find people who are really experienced getting group supervision from each other and it working really well. But actually it can also, and I know this from my own experience of trying to have peer group supervision right after I qualified, it can lapse into what just becomes a bit of a kind of moan zone, as it were. You know, you've got to have actually a real clear focus on what the task is and of getting that done.
Maria, do you think groups can move from one to another? Because I was thinking that with, I've just finished with some MSc students actually, and we used to do group supervision because they were all for research, and they were all doing a similar project with different strands, and we were doing thematic analysis. And to start with, it was very much number 2, in that kind of I was more leading but trying to encourage them to participate, and then once they got the hang of it, it would very much move to number 3, where actually they were coming up with a lot of the ideas and the themes and questioning each other, and it was really lovely to see their development as they got more confident doing it. But there wasn't a clear delineation of me saying, well, I'm stepping back now, guys. It just sort of evolved.
And I think that's a really nice way actually to develop a group. I guess the group context that I specifically intentionally did that in myself was around supervising the third-year trainees with the CBT group top-up supervisions. And again, starting out, we were very clearly in type 2, and I was very consciously moving them towards a much more cooperative group by the end to encourage that development. So absolutely. And I think it's interesting too how a change in the group, a different member joining the group, might push the group in a particular direction or not, as it were. So, you know, I think things changing in the group, things shifting in the group might well switch how things are. So I present this, as I say, because I think often we just neglect thinking at all about group supervision, and we just assume it's an extension of individual supervision. And that's true if you're in this kind of group, but actually group supervision is much more complex and I think involves a whole nother set of skills. As I say, a big plug for Margot, who's coming in November to speak to us more about group supervision.